Let's hope there isn't that delay.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Renaissance Men podcast. I am Michael Perilla.
And I am Vishal Shah, coming at you from the best damn country in the world, the U.S.
And today, we're going to be talking about the UK election that happened several weeks ago and the implications that it has on politics in our own country.
Briefly, before we get right into the meat and bones of it, we did order some food. I ordered some food with a buddy, and so you might hear an unnaturally loud doorbell, and I apologize.
Yeah, so prepare yourselves for that. I recommend you don't wear headphones. But anyways, continuing. So several weeks ago, to talk a little bit about what happened in the recent UK election, the Conservative Party in the UK, which is basically, it's their Conservative Party. They won a majority in their parliament, which actually brought them up to about 365 seats, and they actually made a gain of about 47 seats. Whereas the Labour Party, which is essentially their more leftist party in the UK, they actually lost about 59 seats. So it was a huge defeat for them. And this general election actually came up as a result of consistent delays in Brexit. If you're not familiar with what's been going on in the UK, essentially in 2016, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, and for the past 3 years, their parliament, it has been a conservative majority, but it's been very much split between the Conservatives and the Labour Party. So they have been constantly fighting back and forth, not being able to pass any of the Brexit deals. And in fact, the Labour Party made it part of their mission to make it such that unless the EU was willing to offer the United Kingdom a deal, then they wouldn't be able to leave without a deal, which essentially put all of the negotiating power in the hands of the European Union and handicapped their ability to actually accomplish anything.
By comparison, this is like if you went to a job interview and had absolutely no say in how much you got paid. You're gonna have to settle for whatever they offer you, you know?
Yeah, and so people were getting fed up with this. There have been protests for the past several years in the UK, and deal after deal has been shot down by the parliament, so they've been stuck in the European Union, unable to leave. And, Theresa May eventually resigned because she was unable to get anything done. And then Boris Johnson, the new prime minister, came into power, and basically the Labour wing of the parliament they refused one of the deals that he proposed to get them out of the European Union, and so he called the general election, which basically meant that all of the seats in parliament were up for grabs. And that election happened earlier this December. I believe it was December 13th, and the Conservatives just absolutely wiped out the Labour Party. Long-standing districts that have gone Labour for decades upon decades switched to Conservative, and in fact this defeat, their loss of something like 59 seats, is the worst lost in the history of the UK since I think the 1930s.
Just to reiterate the numbers on this, so 365 seats by the Conservative Party, 203 by the Labour Party, so we're looking at about a little over 1.5 times the number of seats. So incredibly significant there.
Mm-hmm. And, the reason that we're talking about this is because there are a lot of parallels that I think can be drawn between what's happening in the UK politically and what's happening in the US. And so, for example, we talk about the Brexit vote that happened in 2016. Well, Donald Trump was also elected in 2016. And the political movement that followed is very much the same in that pretty much everyone on the left in the UK has been calling everyone who voted for Brexit racists. Their argument for this is that the main motivation for Brexit is anti-immigrant sentiment, although immigration is a very valid concern for the UK, just as it is in the US, and yet same thing in the US, people have been constantly calling people who voted for Donald Trump or people who are concerned with immigration as racists who hate immigrants, but that's simply not the case. There are legitimate concerns to be had. For example, as members of the EU, in the UK's case, there's freedom of movement amongst the EU. So if you're in any country in the EU, you can freely go to any other country. And so there are several countries in the European Union that have much less strict border laws, and so they've been facing a refugee crisis in the Middle East for years now, and there have been millions upon millions of people entering into the European Union. And if you listened to our one of our podcasts where we talked about what's been going on in Turkey, then you would know that this is a huge issue. And specifically, there are also other factors to this. For example, human trafficking is a very big problem in Europe, especially with lots of women being kidnapped and raped also. And a lot of the perpetrators of these are people who are coming into the country or coming into these countries from overseas.
You can imagine there's a slew of crime related to it. But keep in mind, I mean, we're talking about, so the very idea that immigration is a valid topic when it comes to, policy, even that very idea has come into question by many people, specifically left-leaning people, who think that the very idea that we should be regulating who comes into the country is inherently racist. Now, just to be clear, there's a distinction here between, talking about immigration, which any country with borders deals with, and immigrants and the identity of immigrants, which is a total other thing that can go into race and other concerns. But we're talking about immigration in the sense of numbers, people coming in, where they're coming in from, definitely some valid concerns here. But even that concept as a whole, and the statement that immigration can be a valid issue, has almost become a conservative talking point. I just wanted a second to point that out.
Well, I think that it's being portrayed as a conservative talking point, and that's part of the problem. Because now that people who are trying to voice their legitimate concerns with these mass numbers of immigrants that are coming into the country and the problems that are... but not only that, they're being painted as racists, as fascists, and... people who are reasonable and can actually look at these issues objectively see that as ridiculous. And I think that that's part of the reason why the Labour Party suffered such a huge defeat in their election. And it's one of the reasons why I think that the Democrats are going to face a huge defeat in their upcoming election in 2020 if they continue to go down the path that they've been going down, which is the exact same route that the Labour Party took. And in fact, the Labour Party is actually further left than our Democratic Party. I mean, Europe in general is further left.
The word socialist there is not nearly as taboo as it is, for example, in the United States or with major Democrats who are totally comfortable with pushing for policies that definitely seem far more in line with socialist or socialist thinking, at least. But even they are hesitant to say that these are socialist concepts or anything close.
They shy away from it.
Exactly. They're at least a little bit hesitant, and that's not nearly so much the case in the UK.
Yeah, and in fact, I think another one of the major reasons for their defeat, I mean, Brexit definitely played a massive role, and I think that we should talk about why that's so important, because essentially what happened was that after the Brexit election, the Labour Party and the leftists in the UK refused to accept the results of that election. And we have seen very similar things in the United States in regards to President Trump's election. I mean, if you can look up articles from even before he took office of people arguing for his impeachment, and now the Democrats have finally, voted on his impeachment, although technically they haven't impeached him yet because Nancy Pelosi refuses to send the articles of impeachment to the Senate.
We'll repeat that. So technically, until those articles of impeachment are sent to the Senate, impeachment has not technically been completed. And just impeachment in the sense of the actual definition of this, not to say that the president has been removed, which he hasn't been, but even that step of impeachment has not been completed yet. And that's something that is not, at the very least, I could say, it's not clearly mentioned or depicted by the media in our country.
Yeah. And this has also been argued by Noah Feldman, in case you were wondering if this is like some Republican biased argument. It's not, because Noah Feldman was actually, he's a constitutional scholar, but he was also one of the people that was called forth by the Democrats to testify in the impeachment hearings, and he actually said that he personally believed that Trump should be impeached. So this is a guy who thinks that Trump should be impeached, and even he is saying that until the House actually passes the articles of impeachment onto the Senate, that he hasn't technically been impeached. And on top of that, should they choose to hold on to this until 2021 because we're going to have a new election for our House of Representatives in 2020 as well. If they hold it until 2021 when a new House takes office, then it'll actually expire. And if they want to impeach Trump, they'll have to hold an entirely new vote. So essentially, this is like if they had voted to pass a law and then never signed it into legislation.
Yeah.
So Trump could actually go on to claim that he hasn't been impeached, and he would be completely legitimate in doing so. But more to the point, this, I think, to a lot of people seems like it's a political game. This is clearly a tactic that the Democrats are trying to use to win an election. If they truly believed that Trump was this existential threat to the nation, then they would be trying to get the articles of impeachment through the Senate as quickly as possible. Now,
Mitch McConnell has even said that he's totally fine with the circumstances that have been, at least currently, implemented, because he's not, Trump's not under any threat, and as far as what he would have to do in Senate, pretty much nothing. He literally doesn't have to do anything about this right now. For those of you who might be on the anti-Trump side of things, which is totally, obviously I respect your views and have them. That's what's so great about this country, right, is that you can have your views. But just hold the bottles of champagne for now, because it's a little early for that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've heard a lot of people totally celebrate. I mean, if you're on social media, you've seen many people celebrate the idea
Mary
that Trump
impeachments trending on Twitter.
Yeah.
Being posted by, politicians, but also journalists, as if we needed any more evidence that they, weren't biased.
So
hold
biased. The peach schnapps for now, because it's not time to make an impeachment drink yet. But that having been said, this doesn't go anywhere until Nancy Pelosi sends this to Senate.
Yeah, and one of the arguments that she and others have been making is that they are holding on to the articles of impeachment to use as leverage to get the trial that they want in the Senate. But the problem with that is that they don't actually have any leverage. If the Republicans don't give in to what the Democrats are demanding of them, and they never send the articles of impeachment as a result, then Trump never gets removed from office and probably gets reelected, at least in my opinion. And I'll explain why I believe that, because this is all connected to the UK election as well.
Yeah.
But either they don't give in to the demands and the articles of impeachment never go through the Senate and Trump is never removed, or they send them to the Senate regardless of whether or not their demands are met, and then the Republicans hold the trial the way that they want to do it. So I fail to see what leverage that they have. To me, this doesn't seem like a strategic move at all, and if it is, I think that their strategy is horrible.
Yeah, Nancy Pelosi is getting a lot of criticism from her own party because of this, because those who were promised pursuit of impeachment and are knowledgeable for what that means and what the removal of Trump requires feel like they've been backstabbed in some regard. And, I think Pelosi's in this position where she doesn't want to disappoint either part of her party, the more extreme and the more moderate. The more moderate side seems to understand that this is a little bit more unrealistic, perhaps, and the more extreme side is totally gung-ho on this and has been for years. And she seems to be trying to please both sides, and typically that will backfire. Yeah. Typically that will backfire.
And I mean, if you look at what the more moderate Democrats are and how they've been reacting to this impeachment process, several of them have straight up switched parties, some of them going independent, some of them becoming Republicans. And if you actually look at the vote, there is bipartisan support against impeachment, whereas there is only partisan support for impeachment. Only Democrats voted for impeachment. That is not the same as those who voted against. I mean, granted, there are very few Democrats who voted against and very few who abstained, but there is still a significant margin there to suggest that. And by the way, the reason that this is important is because Nancy Pelosi herself stated that if they're going to impeach a president, it has to be bipartisan, because a partisan effort to do so would divide the nation. And yet they have moved forward with it anyways, despite the clear partisan drive to make it happen. And this perfectly parallels to what happened in the UK as a result of the Brexit election, with people, not just on the conservative side, but in the Labour side, saying that, okay, well, we took a vote, we voted for Brexit, now we have to honor the vote. And that's why so many of these long-standing Labour seats in the UK, like seats that and districts that for literal decades have gone to the Labour Party, have now switched to the Conservative Party as a result of the Labour Party's sheer unwillingness to abide by the election. And we are seeing very similar things here, as we've mentioned before, in that the Democrats have refused to accept the 2016 election. They have been constantly trying to undermine and remove Trump from office from the moment, not from the moment he took office, since before he took office. And I think that the average person is going to be fed up with that in the same way that they were in the UK. People don't feeling like their votes are being undermined.
And so two things I want to point out about this with regard to the partisan support for impeachment. Actually, so we live in the Garden State of New Jersey. And one thing that happened recently, correct me if I'm wrong, because I wasn't sure if it was a senator or
he's a representative.
One of our representatives actually recently switched from Democrat to Republican in part over this issue. And seeing how, not to quote him exactly, but he said something to the tune that he was told by party leaders, above him, that he didn't have a choice as to whether or not to vote for or against impeachment, but that he had to vote for impeachment, and that there wasn't that there was no conscious decision about it, and of course that's it's one of our core principles of our government, is that we elect representatives because we trust them to be able to make the right decisions, and that we trust their views. And so if they're not able to even make decisions, then that overall undermines the process that we all hold near and dear. So that's just one example of how this is really drawing lines. And I will say I can, to some degree, hope to commend someone like Nancy Pelosi for saying that there does need to be bipartisan support, but at the same time, and to the other side of that coin, it doesn't seem like she's holding to that.
Yeah,
and
well, I think that she is definitely bowing to
definitely.
the further left pressure, and I think if you have been paying attention to political movements, there is definitely a push to the far left that is being undertaken by both the Democrats and by the Labour Party. And actually, like I mentioned before, the Labour Party is further left than our Democrats are.
In a way, it's kind of like looking into the future a little bit for us. And we're going to talk about this a little bit further, but there are some clear parallels we can draw between how we're seeing the English people respond to their current political climate and how Americans are responding to ours, and some very deep parallels that we can draw on as we continue.
Yeah, and so I think that, furthermore, I think that this is going to be a lot less effective for the Democrats in our country, because even though there is a growing movement of people that are pro-socialism, historically this country is a very center-right country. And so I don't think that their push to the far left is going to be an effective one. But what's even more dangerous is that every time they lose an election, not just the Democrats, by the way, the Labour Party, and many of these leftist parties in Europe as well, as they continue to lose elections to more conservative parties, every time they say that their defeat is as a result of them not going far left enough. They actually blame moderation for their defeat, and this only further pushes them to the left, which I think will further cause them defeats. And it seems like a vicious cycle of far left radicalization that they don't seem to realize. And it's even gotten to the point now where they refuse to accept defeat in legitimate elections. I mean, you have people like Stacey Abrams, who loses her run for governorship in I believe it was Georgia that she was running, and she says that the election was rigged. She refuses to accept the election. Hillary Clinton herself says that she won the election, even though she knows full well that the Electoral College is what determines whether or not a president wins an election. And we now have many politicians arguing for the abolition of the Electoral College. And I mean, we can talk about that as well and why that's a bad idea. But the key point here is that they lose, and then they either blame moderation and therefore radicalize further, or they claim that the election was illegitimate and try to change the rules for elections as a result, because they can't win by the rules that we have been going by for the past several hundred years.
Now, one thing I do want to point out to piggyback on that a little bit is the radicalization that we see with the left, at least moving farther left, doubling down on the claims that they made about Trump in our last election and doubling down on the coverage they gave him. It goes hand in hand with the idea that that one of the reasons that this election carried out the way it did is because of racists, bigots, etc. And that, I mean, there was a huge sentiment, kind of touted by the media that the reason this election happened the way it did is because of a resurgence of racists and bigots and the KKK and every other, racist thing that you can try to mention, and essentially saying that in order for us to move forward as a country, we needed to smite that down at every opportunity. And so that's kind of, and I mention this because it really does go hand in hand with the idea that the left is going even farther left. And in doing so, they're also touting this narrative that the right has moved farther right. And
the Overton window has shifted.
Right, and personally, I don't really believe that the right has moved farther right. This is a personal belief, so
actually,
take that for what you will.
There are lots of statistics that suggest that the right has actually been pulled to the left by the left's lurch over to the left. And so now a lot of conservatives are actually much more centrist. There are still, traditional conservatives, but for the most part, the conservative movement has become a lot closer to centrism than the left-wing movement has. And that's why people who found themselves in the center now relate more with Republicans than they do with people who are now arguing for extremely left-wing policies, things like virtually open borders, universal health care, all of these massive spending bills,
wealth taxes.
Yeah, and then they say that people's taxes won't be raised, but I think people see through that. And I mean, you can look at what happened in the UK election as proof. The Labour Party, I mean, they were. If you think that what the Democrats have been proposing would be an extremely high amount of spending, you should have seen the Labour manifesto that they put out. I mean, they're talking about nationalizing the rails, offering free broadband internet. Like they want to provide free basically everything. And I mean, it makes sense if you actually follow the ideology that the left has been pursuing to its logical conclusion. But all of this to say that people now look at all of these policies and all of these arguments that people on the left are making, and they identify far more with the right now, who are much closer to the center than the left is, who have gone like off the cliff at this point.
Yeah. And so that having been said, part of the thesis of today's conversation is really going to be looking at those parallels and trying to derive what wisdom and foresight that we can based off of the current situation in the UK, and to really understand how that's going to not only affect the US, but how the things in the US right now are going to steer us the way that they have in the UK. And there are far more parallels just in the fact that we have male leaders with blonde hair. There are lots of parallels here to discuss, so
yeah, I mean, to
we can go into that.
To summarize just a bit of what we've already spoken about, there's the effort by the left to paint everyone that doesn't agree with them as racist. That happened here for people who voted for Trump. They called them racist. Same thing happened with people who voted for Brexit. They called them racist, even though in both instances people had legitimate concerns with immigration that are now being completely ignored. And you can't just ignore people's legitimate concerns, because then they're not going to vote for you if you don't listen to them.
The voter demographic was also totally thrown out the window, like as though that had no representation of who's voting for this and why. The perception was touted that this was all not to be crass, but the perception was that this was all white people in the US that were angry that we had a black president, that wanted to see nothing more than a white president who was going to essentially tout their racist views. I mean, the thing about a lot of this all-encompassing like labeling of people is that it's also at the same time very unspecific. And it's easy to say that somebody's a racist. It's hard to say why and what policies they want.
Especially if you don't actually know anything about the person. Like these overgeneralizations simply don't work. And I mean, it shows the disconnect from reality that the Democrats and the left in general has, in order for them to claim that everyone who voted for Trump is a racist when that's basically half the country. Now, I know that there are some people on the left who would suggest that the entire country is racist. And
that's
anyone
goes
who is
into the fringes a little bit.
Yeah,
Yes,
but anyone who has
that has been claimed.
interacted with Trump supporters or with people in general would know that that is just hyperbole of the highest magnitude. Like, even, I mean, sure, you might be able to suggest that people have racial biases. I'm sure that to some extent, most, if not all people do. But I think most people, especially in America, care about freedom and individuality and aren't trying to impose injustice on others. And, I think that there are, like I said before, there are lots of legitimate concerns, right? I mean, immigration is one thing that we've talked about, but there are legitimate reasons that people voted for Trump, especially policy-wise, that have nothing to do with race whatsoever. And so when you suggest that people could only vote for Trump because he's racist, it's simply an argument that doesn't work. And when people hear that, they are much more likely to ignore you, especially if they support Trump.
Now, so there's a dichotomy that I want to point out about this as well. Two things. First, when you call these Trump supporters racists, bigots, etc., oh, and by the way, you can expect a little bit of noise because it looks like our food is here. Just give us a moment for that. But that having been said, there's a dichotomy here that I want to point out. First half of this is that when you call these Trump voters racist, bigots, etc., you're essentially making it so that they have no place within your party. And that's a dangerous thing, not just for the left, but for the country as a whole. Because now you're saying that these people not only will never have a place to call themselves Democrats, and that you can provide nothing for them. And if the left is to win an election, these people are going to feel like they are not just totally disenfranchised, but that they're hated and that they've been made to be some type of enemy. The other part of this that I want to point out is that when we're talking about, or rather when politicians, because we're part of the conversation and that's all well and good, but when these politicians are doing nothing but talking about Trump and impeachment and bigots and racists, anyone who had legitimate faith that these people were going to fix their lives, better their lives, very quickly lose that faith. And I can say that I've felt like that's I felt that way very much, which is to say that I don't need to necessarily agree with everything that the left or the right says, but I can at least hope that they're working in their respective rights to make my life a little bit better and to make the lives of my fellow countrymen better. And when all they're doing is focusing their attention on impeachment, we definitely don't feel like we're being taken care of. We definitely don't feel like we're being listened to or that we are the forefront of their concerns.
Well, it definitely seems as though that they have defined themselves in opposition to Trump in the same way that the Labour Party defined themselves in opposition to Brexit. They have made their opposition to this thing that the people voted for their primary focus. And when you do that, what you are tacitly saying is that you are opposed to the results of democracy, or in our country, the results of our representative republic. And so now it very much seems as though when you do that, that you are trying to undermine the societal structure itself. And this actually makes a lot of sense if you understand more about leftist ideology, specifically socialism and communism, because it is very much part of their goal to undermine the societal structure in order to implement their own new societal structure. But I don't think that that's something that is blatantly obvious to most people. Yet I think most people have a sense for it because they see the rabid opposition to things like Trump and Brexit, and they think to themselves, well, okay, even if I didn't vote for it, the results of our election are that the people did. And so, in order to have a functioning democracy, we have to honor the results of that election. So when you have a faction of people that refuse to do so and do everything they can to prevent that, they are essentially working in favor of the decay of the nation.
Yeah, I mean, this is, at least speaking for myself, I was somebody who was very, very far left once. In fact, I would probably say that I was, looking back, I'd say that I was probably a socialist at one point. I used to tout the view that billionaires should not be able to exist. But you have to really understand what that idea is at the core. And one of the cores of the Marxist philosophy is that all work that is paid for in many regard is a product of a manipulation or theft, which is to say that if I have $20 and I pay somebody 15 of that to do a certain job, that I'm only paying them 15 because the job is worth more than that, and thus I'm manipulating that person and essentially leveraging them or stealing from them. And when you look at that and expand that to the idea of the vote and the idea of our most recent election, the idea becomes something roughly to the estimation that if Trump is winning this election, or if Trump has won this election, it's only because he has manipulated the worst in people to be able to use and thus leverage that to win the election. And it's a rough parallel, but you'd really have to put yourself into the shoes of a Marxist to understand that. And those are shoes that I've worn. But in that regard, that's kind of the core of why we see this continuing idea that everything Trump does is it stands on the shoulders of racist and bigoted mentalities.
Well, I think that there has definitely been a concerted effort to make Trump out to be a racist, especially in instances in which he simply wasn't. And I mean, this has a lot to do with the media propaganda that plagues not just our country, but countries like the UK as well.
If I may, try right now or later after this video to look up and see if you can find practically anywhere the video of Donald Trump talking about the MS-13 and various gang organizations that have worked their way through the border illegally and are committing crimes. The video in which he is claimed by the media to call all immigrants or all Mexicans drug dealers, murderers, and rapists, something to that tune, is a total manipulation. And I believed that video when I saw it until at the time, and this was years ago, so I mean, I really hope you can find the video because it's eye-opening.
Yeah.
That there's an entire, what is at least 3 to 10 minute background of him talking about the various atrocities and various crimes that have been committed by these gangs, and then directly referring to those gangs.
Yes.
When saying that they are murderers, rapists, etc. And the idea that that's been touted as this view that Trump called all Mexicans murderers and rapists, that's a total lie.
And this is a common tactic.
And it's a lie I bought. It's a lie I bought. So I'm telling you this out of my own concern.
And it's a common tactic that the media engages in, especially in regards to issues like immigration, in which people who argue against illegal immigration, or rather people who argue for border enforcement to prevent illegal immigration, are then conflated with people who are anti-immigration entirely. They think that they then conflate that with by saying that those people think that we shouldn't allow any immigrants into the country, which is simply not the case. It is simply that we don't want illegal immigrants, but they say illegal. They don't draw the distinction between illegal and legal immigrants.
Alexander, there's a great video of one of the heads of I'm trying to remember the government organization. It was one of our border security organizations. And he's hearing with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is very clearly trying to there's a word for trying to label somebody as a criminal or antagonize. He's directly trying to antagonize this man in the perspective that it's his fault that children are being basically held at the border, et cetera, et cetera, and directly ignoring the fact that these were laws that had been in place by due process, and that the people that were afflicted by these laws were only those who were brought into this country illegally. And she refused to make the distinction. She absolutely refused to make the distinction that some people were in this country legally through ports of asylum, and that's all well and good, and then other people were going through illegal means and thus were caught and perhaps didn't have documentation, and thus created a much more complex issue that now the U.S. would have to deal with and cope with. And so the devil's in the details.
Yeah, and I think that it can be tricky when discussing particular instances like this and determining whether or not people are acting like this as a result of being propagandized, or if they are doing this in order to propagandize. So in other words, what I'm saying is it's difficult to determine whether or not she refused to accept it because she bought into the propaganda that the media is propagating, or whether or not she is taking part in its propagation.
Yuri Desmanov might have the answer to that, right? Yuri Desmanov might have the answer to something like that. Might. But, a man in former Soviet spy.
Yes, he was an officer in the KGB who defected to America. And one of the things that he stated in an interview that he did in 1985 was that only about 15% of the KGB's budget is designated to espionage, as is often glorified in spy movies like James Bond. The other 85% of the budget of the KGB is dedicated to ideological subversion, which essentially is the propagandizing of and mental manipulation of people into causing them to believe that the capitalist system is evil, and that the only way to defeat it is to implement a socialist or communist utopia. And one of the things that he remarked upon coming to the U.S. was that he was surprised at how effective the ideological subversion had become, to the point where it was now Americans doing it to Americans. In other words, people now buy into the illusion so deeply that whether or not they've been propagandized, or they are going to propagandize other, whether or not it's intentionally. And so I think that this, at least in some part, plays into why people are now propagating things that are patently false, like this conflation between illegal and legal immigration. Right. And I think that one of the things that it does is that it shows everyone who actually lives in reality that these people are fundamentally disconnected from reality. And I think that that is one of the biggest turnoffs for the average person, and one of the reasons that parties like the Labour Party just suffered absolutely catastrophic defeats in their recent election, and why I think the Democrats are going to suffer a catastrophic defeat in 2020 if they continue to go down the path that they are.
A short note, what he's referring to regarding ideological subversion, and how successful ideological subversion implies that the citizenry of a country is doing it to themselves rather than needing an outside influence to pay to make that done, can also be reflected in the Gulag Archipelago. And so if that's something that you're familiar with or something you plan on reading, that's also a concept that you'll see very clearly represented there as well. But so that having been said, returning to the parallels regarding the US and UK elections, I believe you had a list of facts that you wanted to reference to, I believe, right?
Not really. I mean, we've discussed several of the causes and for why the Labour Party lost. I mean, there's the refusal to acknowledge the issue of immigration, as we've discussed at length now, and also, the labeling of people who see that as an issue as racist. There's also their far-left economic policies, their desire to nationalize virtually everything, and their inability to concede that this is going to result in the raised taxes of people. And people like, in our country, people like Bernie Sanders claim that it's these, or actually Bernie is a little bit more honest, but people like Elizabeth Warren.
It's funny, right? Because one of, I believe it was 2 debates ago, it might have been 3, but I believe it was 2 debates ago, Elizabeth Warren has directly asked the question of whether or not her her plans to offer more entitlements would raise taxes, and she at every opportunity avoided giving a clear yes or no answer. And then at some point, as you'd mentioned, Bernie Sanders is very honest about this in saying that yes, we will increase your taxes, and
And
that his idea is that this will decrease spending for the individual in the long term. But yes, at least just being honest and saying this will increase your income taxes.
Yeah, but there isn't actually evidence to suggest that going into a universal healthcare system would decrease the cost of healthcare. But more to the point that I was making, they are trying to make the argument that they can simply tax the wealthy or tax the billionaires and that they'll be able to pay for their programs. But economists have analyzed them and have analyzed their plans, and they've found that, I mean, even if you taxed all of the billionaires in this country at 100%, took all of their assets, you would only really be able to pay for their plans for a single year. And that after that, you have no way of paying for them. And so people understand at some level that they are going to be the ones who end up having to pay for these plans. And I think that, you know, the lies that are being propagated by Democrats and also by the Labor Party that they're simply going to tax the rich, people don't buy it. People understand that there are limited resources.
I should also point out that, this is often labeled as Reaganomics and things like that, and people have the perception that that doesn't work at all. But we are seeing a very robust economy today under Trump's plan and under the new tax plan, which does reduce some of the taxes on the wealthiest and has given them the opportunity to look for other means of generating wealth for themselves, which means hiring new people, creating new infrastructure, making new businesses, and doing other things that our country literally runs on. And there is no other way to do that. That having been said, you'd mentioned that every major economist who's reviewed this has claimed that it'll take, this will substantiate us for at best, I should say, a year. Past that year, you're looking at an entirely crippled economy. I mean, if you think that, for example, if the CEO of your company can't afford to run his or her company anymore, then that company shuts down. And if every CEO has been put in that exact circumstance where they've been made to pay for all this.
We're talking about economic collapse at this point.
Absolutely. And this doesn't just affect the richest. This affects the poorest person who doesn't create their own income and needs somebody else to pay them their wages and they need a place to go to work. They don't have their own infrastructure. They're not self-employed. They need somebody else to sign them a check.
Yeah.
And that's nothing wrong with that at all. Nothing wrong with that at all. But we need the wealthy as part of our society. And if these plans are something that are even implemented, likely the case that before the government even has the opportunity to tax the wealthy to such a high degree, the wealthy will leave.
Yeah.
The wealthy will leave.
By the way,
our infrastructure will collapse, and all of that wealth will simply go somewhere else where it can be either hoarded or can be used to more effectively generate more income for those individuals.
Yeah, and speaking more specifically to universal healthcare and the parallels between the US and the UK actually does have a universal healthcare system, and their healthcare system is collapsing because they don't actually have the resources to keep up with the higher and higher demands, particularly as a result of the immigration that they're experiencing. And so they have actually had to make several cuts, in terms of their spending, because it's becoming untenable. And by the way, they're not the only country that's doing this. There are many countries in Europe who also have universal healthcare programs who have had to cut back because these systems are simply untenable. And it should also be noted that many of these countries don't have their own defense budgets, unlike us, because they rely on us to essentially be the world police. And we send billions of dollars to countries around the world, including Europe, in a financial aid all the time. So in some ways, we are subsidizing them. And on top of that, our healthcare system, which is the best healthcare system in the world, bar none, it's not even close, directly improves every other healthcare system in the world because they benefit from the medical innovations that we create in this country. So
many of these innovations, by the way, are also paved by our military.
yes.
And that military research has actually contributed to many of these medical advancements, the same military that often is discussed to defund.
Yeah. So the numbers just don't work out, and Europe's only able to have the vast amounts of social programs that they have in large part because of us and our protection of them. And even with that, their systems are still failing to the point where they are now having to defund them. So the argument that by the Democrats and by people like Bernie Sanders that we should be more like Europe is an argument that I just find completely ineffective. Why would you want to be like countries that rely on us not only for their safety, but for their ability to have these failing social programs that you are touting so highly, especially when your own plans to have them in our country would completely destroy our economy?
And so just to be clear, we're talking about European countries that have failing healthcare systems, no defense budgets whatsoever, and are largely offering no funding to innovations for new medical research. And so all three of these things are, and these things are entirely rested on the shoulders of the American systems in which we provide the funding for all of these medical advancements, that we provide the defense. And by the way, just as someone who is hoping to join our military, and I believe that is one of the best things you can do for your country, we're talking about the rest of the world essentially looking at us and saying, well, why should we send our young men and women to deal with these conflicts when we can send yours? And so that's something, and I'm rarely very offended by ideas, but the concept that we should be... Some allies are looking at us and saying, hey, why should we have defense budgets when you're taking care of it for us? And the United States pays for it in blood. And so I'm rarely offended to the point of saying so, but that is something that is truly disheartening.
Yeah. And, the reason that we highlight this is because it is yet another parallel between the UK and the US and, another predictor of what may happen in our upcoming election because, like we said before, the left is ignoring the immigration issue, painting people as racist. They're pushing these far-left economic policies like universal healthcare, but also other things as well that I think the average person can see through because the average person has a concept of the idea that resources are finite and that you simply can't tax the rich indefinitely. And so you put these things together and on top of the left's refusal to abide by the results of election, and the general public is simply not going to have it. They're not going to tolerate I'm trying to find the words to describe it, but it seems like the left truly is disconnected from reality. And that is the only possible way that I could explain it. And the average person is not, although they are trying to change that through their constant propaganda. But I mean, if you look at the media's numbers, they're constantly losing viewership. People aren't buying it anymore.
CNN and many other major media outlets are going under. And it definitely doesn't seem like that they'll be around for all too long. There's a few... I want to divert this a little bit back because we did go on a little bit of a tangent regarding how the socialist systems work and how many of the systems in Europe currently work. Just to bring this back to home base, which is the parallels between the U.S. and Britain. And so one prediction that you and I have discussed pretty extensively, it seems, just off air and as well as on air now, it very much seems like Trump will win 2020 election. The 2020 election seems to have been put right into his hands.
Yes.
And furthermore, that it seems that what the left is doing in our country right now is basically feeding him the votes that he will need, much the way that the current goings of the English system are handing Boris votes and making it so that people who would never have voted conservative in the past feel as though they must vote conservative. And so these are very, very deep parallels, and not just in the idea, like I said earlier, that they're strong male candidates. I think it goes much, much, much further than that. And in saying that the average citizen feels as though, like you said, the left is not is disconnected with reality. The average American, I can at least say, feels as though the left is no longer representing their views and no longer advocating for their welfare the way that the conservatives are. And this can be incredibly decisive.
Yes.
And incredibly implicative for our next elections results.
Yeah. And I think that you summed it up pretty well. You know, the UK election and many of its implications on our own politics would suggest that Trump is not only going to win in 2020, but in my opinion, he's probably going to get a landslide. And the Republicans may even take back the House.
Yeah,
it's completely in the realm of possibility. We may see, you know, quote unquote safe Democrat states going red.
Yeah.
It's not impossible. And I think that if you think it is, you are being somewhat naive, especially if you look at what has happened in the UK. And I think that the media will, I mean, as they did in the UK, they constantly are trying to suggest that the left is going to win or that the widespread support is on the left. But I think what a lot of people fail to realize is that there is a lot of quiet support for the right. People who are willing or planning to vote for Trump that simply won't say that.
Yeah,
because they are afraid of the reaction.
Yeah, and if I may, I want to actually add on to that by saying that many of these people who are silent Trump supporters or silent Boris supporters are largely silent, yes, like you mentioned, because of the potential backlash and hatred that they may receive for their respective political views. And I want to take that second to also point out, anyone who disagrees with my political views, I still respect you. I think Mike can also definitely attest to that as well, and he can say the exact same. Part of why this country is so great is because we can disagree. Sorry, I lost my point there just slightly. It's easy to remember how great the country is and forget what you were about to say. It was essentially something to the effect that with the current goings of... It's that these people who want to vote for Trump and want to vote for Boris, it's not just that they're quiet or that they've been silenced by social pressures. It's that they're busy working and that they're busy doing other things in life. And, you know, anyone will tell you, if you go around this country, and you'll see that the average person isn't thinking about politics. They're thinking about how they're going to put food on their family's table. They're thinking about how they're going to improve their own lives. And that citizen is often looking to Trump and thinking, how can Trump better my life? And Trump is making promises that may better my life. And they're not saying the same thing on the left when all they're hearing about is impeachment.
I think you touched on an important point, that most people don't pay attention to politics. And I think that right now, you know, we are still very early on in our own presidential election cycle. And so there are still a lot of people who don't pay attention to the debates like we do, don't follow it like we do. So they're not even entirely aware of the policies that the Democrats are proposing.
Yeah.
But what usually happens is that as the elections get closer to the general, that is, people start paying more attention, right? There's a lot more coverage of it. People will actually start to listen since the vote's coming up. And I think that as that date gets closer, as more and more people start paying attention, they're going to realize how insane what the Democrats are proposing is. And so what you'll probably end up seeing is, as that election gets closer, the tide will turn against them. In much the same way that it did in the UK, and the Labour Party did not expect to lose as catastrophically as they did.
Just as the Democrats did not expect to lose the way they did.
And if the UK election is anything to go by, as we've already stated that we think it is, that could spell huge defeat, far bigger defeat for the Democrats in 2020 than it did in 2016. And in fact, if you look at Brexit, the same thing, right? I mean, Brexit passed, it was a close vote, but it passed, as opposed to this recent vote, wasn't close at all. The Labour Party got destroyed.
365 votes to, I think, seats as opposed to, I believe, 203. And so we're looking at almost double the number of seats, which is incredibly significant. And one thing I also want to just point out, because I feel like we've done an effective job of kind of looking at the parallels and showing where our future could very well be heading. But that having been said, I want to just, if this is even a word, punditize, if that's a word, I want to be a little bit of a pundit here and just discuss the next election, because from where we're sitting, it definitely looks like Trump has this next election in the bag. That's what it's looking like. And objectively speaking, whether you vote for him or not, he has an overwhelming amount of support. He's getting a huge amount of funding, and tactically, he has the high ground.
Yes.
Let's put it that way.
And the Democrats appear to be shooting themselves in the foot at every turn.
Yes, and you know what? I want to clarify even further. The Democrats are attacking a reinforced position from the low ground, and the Republicans are holding a very well reinforced position from the high ground. And whether or not you are on a lefty type or a conservative type, you have to acknowledge the positions that the current climate are in. And that having been said, I mean, I think one of the major questions that you and I have been asking ourselves is Trump going to win the popular vote? Because that
would be a big deal if he did.
That seems to be even more of a determining factor of our future than whether or not Trump wins, because that's not even a very relevant question anymore. I think it looks as though Trump is going to win the next election. An even more relevant question is whether or not he wins the popular vote, because if he does not win the popular vote, there is a very, very good chance that we see the left directly attack the Electoral College.
And Elizabeth Warren has already stated that
that
she wants to be the last president elected by the Electoral College. So should she be elected, she plans to abolish it. They already want to get rid of it. If
dicey. That's
if Trump
we're playing close to the hand right now.
If Trump were to win the Electoral College but lose the popular vote, I think that the left would definitely have somewhat of a meltdown. But it's not as though they would be able to enact what they want to do unless they took office in the future. But their meltdown could preclude that as a possibility.
Exactly. I mean, we saw a little bit of that meltdown with the previous election. And one concern that I have is that if Trump does win by the Electoral College and does not get the popular vote, that the next election will be predicated on the attack of the Electoral College. And this could be very destructive for our country. I mean, whether you understand it or not, the Electoral College exists for a reason. You can research that on your own, and perhaps we'll even do a segment on that, depending on whether or not that's something that our viewers, leave a comment and describe that that's something that they want to see. But this could, if Trump wins the popular vote, then we're essentially going to see a large collapse of many of the narratives and perhaps the entirety of the left, but we're going to see a collapse of those narratives for sure. And we may see a collapse of the party as a whole.
Well, the future of
or at
the
least
Democrat
a total
Party
change,
is
a total metamorphosis of the party as a whole. Because if that's the case, and if they lose the popular vote, they cannot survive by the methods that they've been going.
well. I think that you're definitely touching on an important point, and the future of the Democrat Party is definitely on rocky ground. They have very weak leadership. Amongst the people who are currently running for president, there really is no clear leader. I mean, Joe Biden is the front runner, but if Joe Biden's the best they've got, the guy is going to be gone real soon. He's not exactly a spring chicken. And to put it bluntly,
if we want, if our viewers so suggest, maybe we can just have an episode one day where we just talk about some of the funny, downright ridiculous but funny things that man has said, because. Geez, it does not look like he is all there.
Yeah, but seriously though, I mean, what is going to become of the Democrats? There is right now, as we speak, a legitimate civil war amongst the party between the moderates and the far leftists, and the far leftists appear to be wresting control from the moderates, and that is why many of these moderates are either going independent or switching to the Republicans.
Yeah.
And so if that ends up being the case and all that's left are the far leftists in the Democrat Party, it would appear that the Democrats would continue to suffer losses, and then what happens? I mean, I hate to be a doomsayer, but after Trump's election, we saw riots throughout the country, in many different cities, and I personally think that should he win again, we will probably see the exact same thing. And
perhaps
as these far leftists have already made clear, they are working to undermine the structures of our society. If they continue to lose by the political process, who's to say that they don't abandon the political process altogether? And that could be a very, very dangerous thing.
We've seen this happen before in history. We've seen this with the mob rule of the French Revolution and the horrible implications that can have. And we've seen this with the Soviet system as well. History does repeat itself, and we often see the same things happen twice. And if the system of civility, fairness, due process is thrown out, and if the baby is thrown out with the bathwater, so to speak, then God help us. We could see a downturn in ways that perhaps America is not prepared for. And again, I don't want to be a doomsayer, like Mike said. We at least hope to have an optimistic view about the future.
Well, personally,
we certainly
I think
want to work for a better future.
Personally, I think that the future of America actually looks quite bright. And I think that even if the left decides to abandon the political process entirely, that the country is strong enough to not only survive that, but defeat it. And ultimately rise out of it a more powerful nation. And it would appear that many of our allies are moving in the same direction. I mean, globally, and this is partially why we're talking about the UK election, but even beyond the UK, you look at other countries in Europe and countries like Australia or even India, there seems to be a push back against the leftist ideology. And this is something that I think is going to be of extreme importance moving into the future in strengthening the ties between nations and strengthening each of the individual nations themselves so that we can stand together against what appears to be an ideology that is bent on the destruction of structures in the effort to create a utopia which cannot be created.
Yeah. And Mike, I think we can both agree that we've largely concluded our talking points for the day, but before we go, if I may, I'd like to just sprinkle in one additional thing. And so you've seen our logo here on the back of our laptop as well as on the thumbnail for the videos. And one thing I want to mention about this is that we totally understand that the need for a strong left, that the presence rather of a strong left is something we do need.
Yes.
We need that to be the case. One of the foundational elements of our country has been disagreement and the idea that we will rigorously move back and forth to find the most equitable, the most fair, and ultimately the most reasonable ideas for us to move forward with. I want to point out that our founding fathers had many, many disagreements and often were at each other's throats about whether or not one policy would be better for our country or another. And that part of why we do this is that hopefully the left will see some of that and understand that in order for them to help their constituents and America as a whole, that they need to be using winning policies, winning mentalities. And we're not seeing that implemented today, but we certainly hope that will be the case moving into the future. And in fact, one of the elements, we can go into this, and we both talked about how there are many elements to our logo. One that actually Mike had created.
Yes, essentially what is so important and necessary to any body of politics is a balance between the left and the right, as they essentially in many ways represent a masculine and feminine perspective. And in fact, you can even, if you look at the statistics of who are Republicans and who are Democrats, the majority of Democrats are women, the majority of Republicans are men. And that is, I think, very indicative of the approaches that they take in terms of structuring policy. One of the key features of a more masculine influence, in particular to raising children, a father is much more likely to encourage a child to go out, do things on their own and make mistakes, and not necessarily be overprotective. A more feminine approach to raising children will be a much more protective, overwatching instinct.
To help them recover from those mistakes in many regards.
And both of those things are necessary in raising children. You can't have one without the other, or you create an imbalanced person. And the same is true with our politics. We need the left in order to point out and address the legitimate concerns of people, but we also need a right in order to create a system that allows people to function for themselves. And so when one of those sides is out of balance, it throws our entire body of politics out of balance. And so Vishal is absolutely correct. We need a strong left, but unfortunately our left appears to be going too far. They appear to be trying to break that balance so that they can usurp control for themselves. And that is something that isn't good for either the left or the right, or for any of us for that matter. And that is why the logo is as it is, a red and blue yin yang. And the American flag is in there as well, because we're Americans. This is our perspective as Americans, but the balance between the left and right is absolutely essential to our nation. So
yeah, and I suppose I'll walk us out with that having all been said. Thank you for joining us. We hope to hear from you next time. And of course, we highly encourage that you leave us a comment, like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you can be aware when we decide to go on our next live stream or post the next video. And that having been said, God bless America. Thank you for joining us.
Yep, signing out.